Mr. Martin Chungong, thank you for being with us. You have dedicated, you still are, your professional life to promoting democracy worldwide. So, of course, internet is a fantastic tool for you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for giving me this opportunity to participate in this debate. Yes, we spent a lot of time promoting democracy. But at the start of this message that I want to convey to this meeting, I want to say that when we look at an assessment of democracy, we seem to think that democracy is losing ground. It is under threat and assault. But I hasten to say that this is only a perception. It is not democracy as a system of values and principles that is under threat, but the processes and institutions thereof that are being challenged daily. And I approach this debate from the point of view of regaining trust. I think it's something that the previous speakers have mentioned. How can we restore trust in the democratic processes and institutions? And I take an institution that I know very well, parliaments. When you do assessments of parliament, you see that they rank very low in popularity ratings because of a number of reasons. Parliaments are not seen to be delivering on the people's expectations. They are not seen to be transparent in the way they function and legitimate. It is important then that parliaments embody democracy, and I think that digital technology, access to the internet, gives parliaments the opportunity and the tools to regain that legitimacy that is being lost, especially among the youth who are very adept at this. And for this to happen, we want to see parliaments embodying those core values of democracy that are representativeness. Parliament should be seen to be representative, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the issues that are addressed by parliaments. We want parliaments to be accountable, not only asking governments to be accountable, but they themselves being accountable. We want them to be accessible to the people. We want them to be effective generally in delivering on the expectations of the people. And we do think that these are all things that digital technology can help parliaments do. Parliaments would therefore gain in transparency because then they're closer to the people, especially the young people and women and the marginalized in society. They can promote accountability, not only of government, as I said, but also of the parliaments themselves. Digital technology allows for timely decision-making. Today, the world is evolving very rapidly, and institutions of governance have to react and respond in a timely fashion. And I think that technology allows Parliament to do this. I've mentioned legitimacy of the decisions, because the decisions will be informed by the interests of the people as expressed through the media, through internet, and the like. And of course, it is important that government and parliaments be seen to be accessible to the people, and technology, digital technology allows this to happen. A question was raised. You raised a question as to what stakeholders should do. I think that parliament should not only be expecting technology to happen upon them, they should be promoting the responsible use of technology. My colleague here mentioned misuse of the media, fake news. It is for parliaments to establish the frameworks, the legislative frameworks that would help us streamline the use of technology to good effect. And I think that it is important. There is ample evidence out there from our point of view that parliaments are embracing these new technologies. They are using it to carry out major innovations and transformations in parliaments, and also looking at how they relate to citizens, to civic society, young people, and how they're using this to improve upon the internal working methods. And I think that this is very crucial. Again, I want to conclude at this stage that parliaments have there a great opportunity to regain legitimacy, to regain trust in the people, from the people. And that's the message I want to convey here. Of course, we'll go into the discussions later on, and I can provide more examples of how parliaments are using these new technologies.
Please deliver us some examples of what has been done so far for that. Thank you very much, Martin Chungong. Mr. Hossam El Gamal is with us. Hello. Hi. You're the chairman of the Information and Decision Support Center for the Egyptian Cabinet. We were talking about fake news just earlier on, and you were saying that, and that's a really interesting example, you have set up a form of, it's like an application to check and to what the rumors are about the activity of the government. Is that it?
Yes, I thank you very much for the introduction, and I reiterate what just have been said. There are few examples, certainly in developing countries, that may show the benefits of digitization on the democratic discourse. We will not talk about the challenges now, but about benefits. Yeah. First of all, the Egyptian Cabinet Information and Decision Support Center is a hub where information is gathered for the Egyptian cabinet and then analyzed, and then decision support suggestion goes to the cabinet. But along with that, and with the digitization era, it was important to be able to give the citizens the opportunity to voice himself. And in fact, the benefit of digitalization goes for governance, for financial inclusion, for citizen voice, for social inclusion, and for viable information sharing. And for this, we have few solutions that we have implemented that might be useful to share. We have an application on the mobile, on the smartphones that is called IGABI, which means positive, that engage the citizen to voice himself, to give his opinion, and also to reflect if there is any complaint, if there is any rumor, if there is any problem happening, even general. And this is gathered in this hub that is a neutral body within the government, analyzed, and then reviewed with the different authorities in order to see if the rumor is right, if the information is correct or wrong, and then we provide feedback through mass media to correct the information if it is wrong. If there is a complaint, then we follow up with the authority to make sure they handle the complaint on time. But more important is to analyze if there is any problem of corruption, if there is any issue that needs to be handled with implementing new policies, etc. So once again, an application. We have also a website solution for e-complaint. It's a centralized government e-complaint system that is reviewed not just by the cabinet, but even by the presidency. So in order to be able to have a governance, a way of each authority to make sure that everyone is really moving on implementing solution where the citizen is the central focus of it. But more than this, I would say that we use digitization to achieve social inclusion, because in fact, with the information that is gathered, we are able to identify the underdeveloped villages and communities, and we are able then to communicate back with those communities and identify their exact needs, so that we minimize the social divide that is there. I can stop here and then
we'll go back to your example.
Thank you
Very much, Mr. El Gamal. Of course, it's going back to public trust as well, because as we heard earlier on, the public trust in parliaments and governments is not that high. So of course, if we've got application trying to communicate with the civil society, we need that trust, of course. Please welcome Mrs. Malavika Jarayam. Hello, thank you for being here with us. You're the Executive Director of the Digital Asia Hub, which is an independent research think tank incubated by the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Thank you for being with us. What do you know about this public trust, and what are the main benefits we have to capitalize, maximize today in terms of digitization, please?
You seem to have married me off prematurely, but that's okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Fake news. I'm always so happy to be here. It's the closest I ever will get to being in a Star Wars movie. This is like being in the Star Wars Federation, you know, looking out across a room like this. And it sometimes when you listen to views from different people from across the world, different cultures and values, it does feel like they come from alien planets. So I think it's not an inaccurate analogy. So thank you for having me. I wanted to also say as a preliminary point that this sort of binary that we've divided the panel into in terms of benefits and challenges, I think it's a really good forcing function, because for some of us who tend to work on one side of the spectrum rather than the other, it's good to push us out of our comfort zones. I'm much more comfortable on the dark side, not to carry the Star Wars thing on any further, but so it's really good to actually see that in every technology, you know, it's sort of like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing. The act of observation changes the phenomenon. Looking at a technology as beneficial actually makes you see things very differently than if you look at it for all the challenges and the things that can go wrong. At the Berkman Center, we play this wonderful game, which is sort of moral panics and progress narratives, where exactly the same technology we sort of throw out into the room, and half of the room talks about all the different moral panics associated with, you know, say, self-driving cars, all the things that could go wrong. And the other side of the room is coming up with all the different progress narratives that you'll see in the media that the tech industry promotes about how it's the best thing since sliced bread. And then we swap. And I think that's kind of exactly what we're doing here, which is great. I think for me, I think we have to see this issue as one of digital citizenship. I think the second we think of it as a handout or a subsidy or an entitlement, something we're giving to other people who are targets of development, I think we failed. If we don't acknowledge that users, consumers, subjects, whatever you want to call them, you know, they're all pejorative in some way and enabling in others, I think unless we see them as equal participants and co-creators of a shared future, I think we're going to fail. So I think that's the first point I want to make about digitization, that we often see it as something that a government rolls out as a benefit, as something that, you know, it's an end goal in itself. It's not necessarily a process. It's not something that has to be embedded as part of a socio-technical system. I was very happy that the, you know, Commissioner said that we see them as systems and not just as particular points or processes. I think that's a really key point, that we don't see them as targets. And I think also in all of this sort of rhetoric about digitization and benefits and, you know, we're developing people, I'm always reminded of something, the very, very often quoted line about a society will be judged on the basis of how it treats its weakest members. And half the room is probably going to say Gandhi said that, and that's another piece of fake news. It wasn't, but it's popularly attributed to him. It was Pope John Paul II. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind as well. And I think there are certain business models that optimize for certain outcomes, that benefit certain actors and the incumbents, the providers of the technology, the governments in power, that actually enable and amplify power structures and existing structural inequalities. And I think if we don't actually focus on the edges, the margins, the outliers, I think we run a very real risk, especially with algorithmic decision-making and sort of data-driven policy-making. Data tells lies. Data can tell any story you want it to, right? There is nothing objective or neutral about data, and I think that's one of the first lessons we're learning as we see systems fail and break down. And I think if we don't actually actively cater to counter the harm that can happen to the outliers and the weakest on the margins, I think that's a real problem. So I think actually one of the great benefits I see of technology is, with all of the focus on bias and discrimination and algorithmic fairness, I think it's forced us to have a conversation not just about how flawed technology is, but how it reflects how flawed society and humanity is. And I think the more we talk about fake news, the more we talk about the things that algorithms do wrong, or the ways that they amplify racism or homophobia or other kinds of awfulness, I think they reflect the ugliness, they mirror society. And I think in the same way that technology can be used to exacerbate those, if we could actually harness the same tools to optimize and nudge towards good outcomes, I think the same bias that we see, we can actually nudge towards great outcomes. So I feel it's sort of, exactly the same tools that can actually engender bias are the same tools that, if you know certain kinds of data sets are not representative, you can counter for them so that actually the outcomes are better than you would have offline.
Do you have an example of these tools precisely? If we could use the same tools, what could they be?
Lee from Microsoft mentioned at the AI for Good conference earlier this year at the ITU, he talked about how so many polls got it wrong about the result of the US election. And one of the polls that was actually really accurate was from the Xbox. And you would think that's really bizarre because it's a very narrow margin of 18 to 22-year-old men. Why would anything like that be representative? You know, when they did a survey on the Xbox, how would that possibly represent people? And they turned out that because they knew they were dealing with a small slice of the population, they corrected for it. Right? So when you know that a particular population database is skewed, when you know that the data you're dealing with is not representative, you can actually use the machine learning tools to compensate for that. So I think in similar ways, when you know you're dealing with poor people, when you know you're dealing with a neighborhood that has fewer schools or less temples or churches or, you know, less financial aid or fewer banks, when you know that that's what you're dealing with, the algorithm could actually, in the way that banks lend money to people who already have money and will never lend to those who don't need it, like there's always that barrier, I think that's something that technology tends to do. It tends to favor people who already have it. And I think if we know that, we can actually compensate for that and say, okay, we're dealing with 18 to 22-year-old men. Let's normalize across that and standardize it for having more women, different age groups, to make the data set more representative. So I think that's just, you know, one little example. But I think the other benefits of technology are ways in which it can actually close skills gaps, the ways that it can close participation gaps. And I think a lot of emerging economies are, you know, we've always had this history of looking to technology as a savior to help us leapfrog various stages of development. You know, we missed this, you know, we didn't have 2G, we went straight to 4G, right? Or we didn't have the Industrial Revolution, we just went straight to something new. But I think what we lose in that is we haven't had the time to actually form the institutions, the rights, and the values in a society that actually go with that sort of leapfrogging of technology. So you go straight to a new tool or to a new paradigm or future without having learned through the mistakes of what went wrong with other technology. So I think sometimes going for the shiniest and the newest is not the best solution. And I think in the way that governments go through endlessly bureaucratic processes, you know, when you buy fighter planes or you do anything, by the time you actually procure technology, it's already outdated, it's redundant. But I think there is some value in actually having the time to look at the impact of something, to study pilots. And that's something technology providers don't necessarily do, especially when the prevailing narrative in Silicon Valley is fail faster, break things, right? Governments don't fail faster and break things because that failing will reflect in the next election, right? They have the right incentives to perform well because they'll be voted out of power. So I think, as with a lot of these problems, the solutions will come from a multiplicity of actors. And I think something like the digital or the promise of digital transformation isn't something that governments can provide in and of themselves because they're often behind the curve on technology. But, and you know, there's often this statement about how we've got technology 4.0 being dealt with by policy 2.0. Yes. There's always that gap, right? Course, yeah. But I think that's where civil society plays a really good role in sort of being that mediator. Technology companies, when they do try to do good, can fill that gap and actually help equip governments with skills. But I think it takes civil society to push back and say, what are the incentives? Who are we optimizing for? Who is this really going to benefit? And did you even ask them if they wanted this? Did you take consent? And was it meaningful? Was it informed? And I think that's something that technologies like artificial intelligence completely disrupt. The idea of consent, the idea of personally identifiable information, because when everything is in the aggregate and everything is being done without people's active participation or consent, that's a real problem. But I think equally artificial intelligence does pose a lot of, it does hold a lot of promise at scale.
Yeah, we'll be able to discuss.
We can do that later, yeah.
Benefits and challenges. Thank you very much. You've emphasized as well the role of and responsibilities of multi-stakeholders in terms of benefits. Ms. Dunja Mijatovic, thank you for being here. You're an international expert on human rights and media freedom. the multi-stakeholders' roles and responsibilities in benefits, is it working? Are the relations strong enough to work together?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, that was not exactly what I was told I have to discuss here on the multi-stakeholder process, because I think there are more.
Well, it was just to react to what we've heard. But
no
please,
problem.
I mean, please deliver your main message.
And the main issue here, and I'm sure that there are many colleagues that can talk about multi-stakeholder process, and something that is of crucial importance when we discuss the topic today. It seems to me that we are somehow ill from this virus that is called fake news. If we look at media reports, it would seem that we are discussing a new concept, something completely new. Fake news also has become a political and popular obsession around the world. And we are even stating that the multi-stakeholder approach can fix fake news. As a label, the term has also been invoked by political leaders, and this is something that we should not forget about. And it was invented in attempts to discredit legitimate journalism and to brush off calls for accountability. Perhaps even more worryingly, there have been calls to ban or restrict false news through the adoption of legal measures. And the last thing we need, I would say, in democratic society is an overreaction. And I think we are overreacting at the moment. I know that many would disagree with me, but there is no single day that we do not hear from international organizations, governments around the world, democratic governments as well, that they will fix fake news by establishing certain agencies, high-level panels, wise men, sometimes women as well, discussing these things and trying to fix the problem that we are all facing as societies. Fake news is not new, and it's old as humanity, I would argue. The potential impact of fake news certainly increased after the invention of the printing press in 1439, and increased again in the introduction of film, radio, and television in the 20th century. So yet in the internet era, we are with the boundless possibilities. Of course, the dissemination, the speed, and everything is changing, and we are more exposed as a societies. But my question would be also for our discussion here: why would I, as a citizen, trust any international organization, not to mention government, telling me what is right and what is wrong? I think it's almost like filtering our minds, not to mention attempts to block. So instead of pouring the funds and financial aid to public service broadcasting, to media, to new online portals, to international organizations to work on media and internet literacy, we are seeing this sort of sudden movement in establishing certain agencies and organizations that are dealing with fake news. There are NGOs that are fact-checking, and this is something that I think we should welcome, and it's of extreme importance. But I'm very much against the potential shifting the responsibility from the state to the intermediaries. And this is happening as we speak in too many countries at the moment. I do not think engine searches and the intermediaries can have this responsibility. It's like shifting the responsibility from the state, not to mention judiciary and the role they have in our societies. We should not forget about this. I think we already have tools at our disposal, particularly in democracies, to fight this problem. But the way societies are moving at the moment, I think it's also affecting journalism a lot, and this is something that we should take into consideration and really do as much as we can in order to protect journalism, investigative, real journalism that also is suffering because of these global changes that we are all facing. There is an urgent need, I would say, for a smart answer to disinformation and propaganda, as their damaging effects are visible to all of us. But there is also an urgent need for a smart answer to the attempt to fix the problem that our societies are facing. And at the moment I can see that also here since yesterday I heard many saying, yes, we organize this, so we will fix it, and then the society, it's somehow like we all became so stupid suddenly and we cannot really make our own decisions and really decide, what is right and what is wrong.
So you calling to individual responsibilities of all of us?
Absolutely, individual responsibility. I mean, if we are, capable people of making our own decisions, but I think we failed as a societies in the attempt to educate, particularly when it comes to internet and media literacy, in the process of digitalization, in the process of more information. I think we even failed if we start from kindergarten, from the really small children that needs more education on our digital life. And this is something that I would like to see governments doing, pushing more funds and efforts in doing this, and not really organizing new agencies and trying to fix something that I do not think is fixable in this way.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ms. Najira Sambuli, you're the Digital Equality Advocacy Manager at the Web Foundation, where you lead advocacy efforts to promote digital equality and access to and use of the web. We've been talking about, of course, the benefits in terms of inclusion. And of course, that's one thing that you observe in your work. Let's hear about you.
Thank you. So, I mean, at the core of this discussion around political processes is a question of power, and who has it and for whom it's being asked to be brought back to be distributed to all citizens. I want to just highlight, for instance, as Malavika was saying, we tend to be on the challenger side, but I just thought I'd reflect on the fact that, maybe a couple of IGFs ago, a high-level session like this would have been all men talking about the, digitization. But what has happened with the internet and spaces for discourse is that even once we leave rooms like these discussions go on. Things that would otherwise be normalized the moment we walk out that door are not easily normalized anymore. Politics of representation has been one great stride we've seen, and especially where gender dynamics are involved, representation vis-a-vis global north, global south. These conversations are being taken beyond rooms like these, and they continue in these spaces that have been occupied by citizens. I'll give, again, a practical example of a big challenge that I'd love to hear Mr. Martin respond to from Kenya, where I'm from, where women who constitute 52% of the population have been using primarily digital platforms because it's an issue that's been ignored in the media about the unconstitutionality of our entire parliament, of many constitutionally appointed bodies, including a cabinet that's about to be appointed. The question is whether it will adhere to the two-thirds gender rule. Now, this is a huge issue that would not be solved overnight. It's an issue that, I guess, when it comes to discussions of gender offline and in traditional spaces of discourse in public spheres, has been ignored and normalized. But women are occupying digital spaces in whatever way they have access, whether it's just a Twitter site, whether it's just Facebook, whether it's exchanging emails, to just say that we have to make this an issue, a thorn in the flesh in the political system. And it's going to be wonderful to just see what happens when even more women who are not connected gain access and bring their own perspectives on the issues of how they should be represented, how they want to have their own voice coming up. Now, I just want to draw back the link to the fact that political voice and political processes, as we see them through digitization, are also a function of how they've been understood offline. And so what we're seeing with people coming online is two-pronged approach. We're trying to negotiate our citizenship, as Malavika was saying, in a digital world, but also reclaiming this democratic values that for many countries have existed on paper, but are negotiating through dialogue, through argument, through fake news, and demystifying this fake news to figure out what actually we mean by democracy, what we mean by the values that are enshrined in it. And I think it's a great time to be alive, but at the end of the day, we all have a role to play in making sure that even in how digitization is enhanced, it's also not denying people power and creating new divides.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the list of benefits you gave us. Robert Strayer, hello. Thank you for being with us. You're the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy at the US Department of State. Well, let's hear you on the benefits. We've been talking about fake news. We've been talking about the problem of public trust. I know it's a big issue in the States as well, of course, and we're all witnessing it because you have a very participative President Trump, notably on Twitter, so we know a lot about him. Let us tell us what's your view about all this.
Great, thank you for the introduction. It's a privilege to be with these distinguished panelists and with all of you participating in the IGF. Democratic processes and public trust are the foundation of everything we do. And the source of legitimacy for any public policy that we create must be grounded in that experience by all of us, our fellow citizens. I'm pleased that this high-level session is devoting time to appreciate the positive dimensions of digitalization before focusing on the related challenges. As we consider how best to meet the challenges to our core democratic values, we must remain vigilant to not undermine the many benefits that technologies have brought. In the United States and around the world, citizens are assembling online and organizing their advocacy both in the virtual and physical worlds. We must also remember that these online spaces are even more critical in parts of the world where democracy is not practiced, where political activity is not tolerated, and where public trust is replaced with fear of reprisals. But on the positive side, we have seen people able to start participating in their democracies, in public debate, and determining their own futures through being online. I'd like to offer 2 practical steps that we can take to strengthen the positive aspects of digitalization. First, given the centrality of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly to the democratic process, we must ensure that people are able to exercise these fundamental rights online. It's primarily the responsibility of governments to ensure that their citizens are protected online. But it's also true that other stakeholders should recognize and be aware that the same rights individuals have offline must also be protected online. So they also have a role. Second thing I want to highlight is that there's many processes for collaborative and participatory involvement in making decisions, but those are still being developed. We're still in an early stage of thinking about how best to have multi-stakeholder participation. So all of us here and all stakeholders should seek to identify ways that we can further improve and find the best practices for a participatory decision-making process. And we should seek to make the most robust, inclusive, and deeply participatory stakeholder models that we can, both for the benefit of what we do on the internet and for democratic institutions around the world. In that regard, I'd like to point out that the IGF is a valuable resource for collecting positive stories for how technology has positively shaped democratic and participatory outcomes. I've heard some of the stories this week, particularly from civil society, and I hope that we have time today to discuss more of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're running a bit late on our schedule, but still I would like to have a little form of exchange amongst our panelists before we go to the audience. You wanted the reaction of Martin Chungang earlier to of course.
I'd just be curious to hear now that he said, many parliaments and through processes like the Parliamentary Union need to be more citizen-facing, how they would encourage, say, the Kenyan Parliament to recognize the voices that are being raised, because what also happens is the processes of engagement and making your voice heard do start in these platforms, but being acknowledged and being invited to actually dialogue and figure out how to proceed is a whole other matter. So in his view, I'd be curious whether he feels parliaments are ready to engage and cede that power of being behind the iron wall, if you will.
Thank you for this. Martin Chungang.
Thank you very much. It so happens that the Kenyan Parliament is one with which we're working when it comes to the issue of gender equality. And that two-thirds gender rule that my colleague mentioned is something that has been at the fore of the discussions we've had with the Parliament. In the previous Parliament, before the one that has been elected, we started that reflection, and we have provided tools for them to ensure that the parliament is legitimate and constitutional by respecting the two-thirds general rule. And this is premised on the fact that, yes, it is important to give online access to everybody to contribute to democracy processes. But at the end of the day, how are the decisions being made? Are they being made online or in the formal structures of parliament? So for us, it is important that women be at the table, rooms like this, where the decisions at the end of the day are being made in parliaments. And so you have online participation, which is important to inform decisions, but also the presence of women physically in parliament in order to participate in the formal decision-making processes. So this is something that we are engaging with the Kenyan parliament to try to fix. It's not easy because there's a lot of resistance from some quarters, including among men. And my colleague, I think that it is something you and I can discuss and see how we can be most helpful to the parliament.
Thank you very much. Would someone like to react? Yes, please, Excellency.
I was wondering, listening to my panelists, about the media in fake news and fake information. Well, in Bangladesh, we are a victim to this provocative, instigated fake news. I call is information terrorism. And information terrorism is a tool of the terrorists on the ground. And in Bangladesh, dual action. On the ground, the terrorists are attacking government installations, other religious institutions, churches, mosques, and other things. And on the internet, there is info-terrorism going on. They are placing religion against democracy in a confrontative position. So that is a challenge in the present-day constitutional and democratic situation, how to combat information terrorism. So that...
If I may, how do you draw the line as a government between trying to tackle the problem and balancing into censorship? I mean, you want people to have freedom of expression. That is also a human right. But so how do you, so how do you draw the line and how do you act?
In the media, as I told yesterday.
If you can speak a bit closer to the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you. We are not going for censorship.
No.
Because constitutionally, the freedom of the press is guaranteed by constitution. There is a rare constitution in the earth where this clause is inserted in Article 39, where press and journalism is protected, besides other human rights. My point is we are not going for censorship. We are trying to combat this info-terrorism by enacting a broadcast commission and for the electronic area and broadcast law in line with the human rights and freedom of press and freedom of expression. But we'll have to understand that fake news, it is creating a problem. But info-terrorism is a different thing. Info-terrorism is coupled with a terrorism at the ground. So there is info-terrorism going on against Christianity, say, for example, or Islam. And then on the ground, the fanatics, religious fanatics are attacking mosques, churches, and pagodas. So this is a couple things. So it is a criminal activities, but it has a political dimension.
Thank you.
That is interesting. And another thing is for the digitization process, e-governance is very important. In our country, we are digitizing the whole government machinery. Government is giving pro-poor services. So when you digitize the whole government apparatus, that ensures better service to the poor. Better service. I'll come back later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Katerina, shall we just take a few reactions and comments from participants to our high-level session online outside this room?
Okay, thank you so much. We had a very interesting discussion online which touched on a lot of topics the panel has been talking about: big data, fake news, citizen empowerment. I'd like to share two comments in particular. The first one comes from Barack Otieno, who is from Kenya, and he combined a number of themes in his comment online. So he said, for example, fake news will always thrive in the absence of a strong value system. He also reminded us that we should study the correlation between fake news and big data. And he very much also mirrored this comment by Ms. Mijatovic on individual responsibility as a factor and in correlation with value system that we need to support and embrace. And finally, being a Kenyan, he very much agreed with Ms. Sambuli's comment about digital empowerment of citizens in Kenya. Another comment comes from Christian Aihaizu from Nigeria, and he was very interested in fake news, and he reminds us that there are technical solutions for fake news that we need to look at.
Technical solution. Before I get back to you, Elganam, just a reaction probably, Ms. Mijatovic, on the solution. You say we're overreacting, but still, obviously, it's a main concern for everybody. Some of the tools, probably one example.
The overreaction that I'm talking about is the overreaction to certain news that we can also call stupid, provocative, vulgar, something that we have to, or I thought we accepted as a price to live in democracy. I do not want my right to be shocked or discussed with certain views to be taken away from me, and somebody else tells me what is right and what is wrong. But what we are discussing here is also a problem with propaganda, with the information wars, with many societies facing propaganda from different states and information used as a tool. Also criminal acts that should be dealt with using everything we have at our disposal as a society, infrastructure, institutions, incitement to hatred, calling for killing people, matters of national security. That is something that is not debate or discussion about free speech agenda. That is an anarchy or a crime, and it has to be taken.
Set of values we have in common outside and outside.
Absolutely. Yeah, but I think we are also mixing these things in this discussion about fake news, and what we are actually affecting is our right to accept information that we also do not like, and that is the problem that I see is growing.
Okay, Mr. El Salam.
Hussam El Gamal. Okay. We have been facing, well, everyone have been facing fake news and manipulated information, and Egypt, among others, especially in an area of lot of debates, we have faced this a lot. And one thing is, I just want to highlight that social media and digitization went very fast, and many we need to accommodate this in our society and life in a regulated way, if possible, or in an institutionalized way. And simply, the problem of manipulated information, I see at least several. One of them is related to privacy. It is not about this fake news or manipulated information will affect generally direction of political decision, but it could sometimes cause issues related to a patient somewhere. And in many countries, we don't have privacy regulation. And this is extremely important related to diffusion of information, because I do not expect to find my health file published and manipulated on a social media. So one of the great challenges is privacy, and how we can put regulation that can make sure that privacy is not broken. Another one is, strangely, manipulated information is becoming an industry. So it is not just a coincidence that we are facing manipulated information or fake news. And the problem is that diffusing manipulated information on the World Wide Web or on the social media is in the hand of the financially capable who can do this. So even if you have the right information, you don't have the same balanced right to correct, regardless if this is government, if this is NGO, if this is the citizen. But you can find easily on social media sponsored and boosted manipulated information with thousands of dollars, and this is the only way you can spread it all around. And the correct or legitimate body is not capable of defending the right information it has. So we need to identify ways of handling this. In all cases, the simplest way is that we are now doing it through our Information Decision Support Center is, at least for the government, whenever there are manipulated information that is provided through social media and mass media, we review with the right body the exact information regarding a project, regarding a policy, regarding a plan, and we just bring it back in a clear way, provided back to the citizen. And this is, in our opinion, we don't censor, we provide the right information, and we try to provide it as much as possible through mass media within the country. But again, we face the disbalance of financial capability that boosts such manipulated information, whether from a terrorism organization or from anybody that can be there. Just to add, for the challenges, we certainly have a problem with the international cybercrime policy. We don't have something that gathers us on cybercrime. And this is part of, if the manipulated information or fake news or a problem happens and cause disruption, who to blame?
Let's go, if I may,
Please.
Mr. El-Gamal, let's go back to benefits. It must be something about human nature. We keep going back to challenges. So probably the room can help me and share with us some of the benefits of digitization of society on, well, public trust, democracy, participation in politics. Are there any comments, experiences you'd like to share? Yes, please. Would you just press on the button of the mic and it will go red? There you are.
Thank you very much. For the record, my name is Dr. Subhi Chaturvedi and I come from India. Just as far as numbers go, we've talked about it. I'm a former MAG member. We have over 1 billion connections in India, and yet only 28% people in India are online. The tremendous potential for women to work from home, to be able to experience agency and voice, it is incomparable when you're looking at a society that has cultural barriers, social barriers, that has patriarchy. I've taught at a women's college. We know what young girls can do when they're able to actualize their potential when they go online. India is now looking at moving towards being a 1 billion+ digital economy. I also, I think internet is an empowering tool. It has a way in which it changes lives. For people who are away from education, that first direct experience of literacy, 200 million women people in India are keypad literates. So I can't emphasize enough on what it means to experience the internet in a developing country and emerging economy. I do want to end with a short question, if I may. We've been talking about barriers and challenges, and when Minister Haq talks about the fact that the internet should be a fundamental right, it's music to my ears. But I also worry when I hear statements where we're talking about a government-led initiative where you want to enshrine some mechanisms in which you can dispel misinformation, disinformation. What has been of concern for us in developing countries is when incidents occur online, the natural reactions of governments is to control. As far as a senior journalist, we've learned truth, objectiveness, fairness and balance is something that comes. What we've not seen from governments is utilization of the same power of the internet and all the institutional resources that they have to engage on the same public sphere to dispel misinformation. It takes about 3 days to sort of say and declare that this is a fake piece of news or this is a 3-year-old video, while citizens may be at risk. So instead of saying that natural processes of self-regulation should not come into being, instead of countering speech with more speech, let us not look at a slippery slope where we can look at more regulation, because that the internet will not like or cherish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the first part, especially where we had some of the benefits to digital economy, notably in India. I think we have Bruna Santos, a representative of the young, I don't know, no. So let's, I think we have comment here, and then we'll go further in the room. Just press on your microphone. Let's try and stick to benefits that we could highlight.
Yes, benefits, and unfortunately some gaps. But
yeah,
definitely,
gaps and challenges
yes, I'm Divina from EGGS, and I'm speaking for the academia group and for the foundation Savoir Devenir. And I've been a long-time proponent of media and information literacy, and I'm very pleased that on the panel this topic was mentioned several times. We have many very good practices on media and information literacy, and for us, Internet has been an opportunity to spread them, to upgrade people's skill on the digital level, digital citizenship. We've worked with entities like UNESCO, the Council of Europe, that have been extremely active, and I think it's been a golden age for INGOs like these to provide intersectorial opportunities across education, across culture, across media, and there's really many examples. There's a mapping that has been done for Europe. I would call for a mapping to be done for the rest of the world, just to show the abundance instead of the scarcity in which we were before the digital era. So for us, educators, this has been a plus. And yet, nothing is happening at a national level. Media literacy is always used as a kind of lip service to what the new literacies are about. And so I'm extremely preoccupied at this. To push the conversation, I would say thank you, fake news, because fake news allow us to have a sort of crash course 101 on what it is to be media literate. How to read what's happening online, how to go back to the sources, how to see who is saying what, with what agenda, what advanced agenda, what hidden agenda, etc., etc. So let's use fake news not to disengage the states, because that's how it's happening, and I agree with Mrs. Mijatovic about that. Let's use fake news to re-engage the states, because what is missing is the engagement of the states at national level, in schools and out of schools, with real money, not sprinkling, not just parsley putting on a salad, really going into the deep uses that we can make of media and information literacy. So this is what I would really call for. If we have been too soft, and this is something I'm saying to all of us, we have been too soft on these issues. We have been treading on the edges. We're still treading on the edges. We are not engaging, and we should be much more disruptive in the male constituency, the people who are supporting male. We need to claim that there is a different alliance of learning and knowledge that has to appear in the digital age. New cyber literacies. We need to really say to the schools, learning the old way is not going to help young people today with the democracy that they need to create. And Internet is disrupting democracy as we knew it, and it's not a bad thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the call for cyber literacy, and for going back to the practices. It goes for journalism, and we'll probably talk about that later on, about the practices of journalists as well, facing fake news. Yes, the woman, please. Yes, you've just switched your microphone. Please do.
Me?
Yes.
So my name is Selena. I'm from ITS Rio, which is Institute of Technology and Society of Rio. And one of the missions of ITS is to use technology to strengthen democracy. And in moments of distrust, we believe that solution is more democracy and not less. So we created this app called Mudamos. In English, we would say We Change, which is a way to amplify democratic participation by enabling citizens to create and sign new bills online. So it uses blockchain technology to certify each voter, which is infinitely much more secure than the paper that was used until then. So this project has already been used by some legislative houses in Brazil, and it's really been a specific example that can bridge this gap of participation and really create a positive channel for people to participate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, I only have time for a last intervention. Yes, sir, please, you can switch your microphone on.
Woman, can you hear me? Yes, I want to respond to the earlier comments about digital literacy. I'm Larry Maggot. I'm CEO of ConnectSafely.org, and our NGO published a booklet called The Parent and Educator Guide to Media Literacy and Fake News that deals with the kind of the root causes of fake news from the standpoint of why we consume it, why we accept it, and why we pass it on. And it's advice to both teachers and parents. We also have a big element in there about emotional literacy or emotional intelligence. That's also very important. And I would invite anybody here who's interested in either reading or possibly localizing it to visit connectsafely.org/fake news. And finally, I do want to make one question, I guess, to the panel and perhaps to the gentleman from the United States State Department, my own country, is what do we do when our highest political leaders share fake news and then also try to delegitimize legitimate news as well as legitimate institutions such as the judiciary and law enforcement? How do we, as citizens, respond to that type of leadership?
Thank you very much. I think that's for you, Mr. Strayer.
I mean, the core tenet of democracy is that there's a panoply of voices. There's a lot of opinions expressed online. So it's not for the role of the state, of course, to restrict those voices. And, you know, the best way, if one disagrees with their leaders, is to speak out online themselves. And there's been nothing more democratizing than the internet itself. I mean, for so long, you know, we had pamphlets, or you could develop your own newspaper, develop something, but now you have all the online resources at your disposal, and something like Twitter makes everyone able to interact and engage. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you for your response. We'll be continuing on that subject, of course, because I think we've got the message. Fake news is a great concern. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your interventions this morning. I will please invite you to just sit down. For the audience, you can remain seated. We're just going to welcome the second group of panelists on stage to continue the discussion around the challenges. But of course, our first group is staying in the room, and will be able also to interact with the second group. So just stay with us. Thank you. Your names will be put down. So Mr. Duffy on the right side. I'm going to help Mr. Larue. Ah, good. And I was just trying to help Mr. Larue. You're on the other side. On the other side, I think. Please. Here, on this side. This is your... Is that okay? Yes?
What number for me?
What?
What number it is?
You... 3, number 3.
Same yesterday.
No, what you mean in the order of speech?
What?
Yes. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, let's remain seated and let's take our places. I'm inviting now the second group of panelists to really take place on stage so that we can continue the debate. This is a high-level session about the impact of digitization on politics, on public trust, on democracy. We have tried to highlight a number of benefits that we've witnessed so far thanks to internet. But as I said, human nature always catches back up, and we're discussing a lot about challenges, and we'll continue to do so. But still, we probably have solutions to these challenges. If you have solutions, I'm encouraging them. So as we did previously, I would kindly ask you to be as brief and direct as possible in your intervention so that we can have enough time after for debate, and it's really a good thing when you can all answer to each other. That really helps in the debate. I will start. I have to get used now to my new panel. I have just one missing people there. Okay. So Mr. Bobby Duffy is with us because I'm still waiting for Ms. Nad, that is obviously not here yet. So let's start with you, please, Mr. Duffy. You're Managing Director of Public Affairs in the UK and Global Director of the Ipsos Social Research. You have also worked a lot on social exclusion, as I know, and social exclusion will definitely be a big challenge if in terms notably of artificial intelligence, and we'll probably be talking about that. But what would be your main message today about the challenges of digitization, please?
Great, thank you. So I'm delighted to be here. There is so much we could say about this hugely important topic. It's reflected in the excellent briefing paper, which, if you haven't seen, from IGF, which is available online, covers the ground so well. I'm going to focus on public perceptions because that's what we focus on, and we've done work on the impact of digitization on elections, public dialogues on concerns about AI and machine learning, the ethics of using social media data and trust in our data use, and lots more, which we can hopefully get into in aspects in the discussion. But I'm going to limit the opening comments to the challenge of misperceptions and the role of digitization in that, mainly because I'm finishing writing a book on that over Christmas with the January the 1st deadline. So your reflections, this session is very useful, and your reflections today would be very useful for that too. So first of all, there are so many misperceptions around. There are the pure fake news ones, which we've heard about today. So we did a survey for BuzzFeed, and on, for example, the papal endorsement of Donald Trump and his candidacy. And 1 in 5 US online citizens saw that. But the scary thing is that 2/3 of those believed it. Despite the refutations, all the things that followed after. But it's not just those pure fake news things that are the issue. There's also key social issues that can affect our decisions. So we just done a study across 33 countries, which shows that only 42% of the public know that the claim that vaccines cause autism in healthy children is false, and the rest think it's true or are unsure. So to some extent, that's kept alive online and is affecting real people's decisions. And then there's crazy beliefs about the nature of our populations, driven by concerns in the coverage we see. So in that same study, people think the murder rate is increasing when in most countries it's decreasing. In the Netherlands, the average guess is that 51% of the population, prison population, are immigrants in the country when it's actually only 19%. So there's all these misperceptions. So I just want to make 2 points on this. There's 2 elements to why we're wrong. It's what we're told, which is a lot of what we're focusing on today, what we see, but it's also how we think. Misperceptions have always been with us, and one of my favourite quotes on this is from Francis Bacon from 1620, who said, "The human understanding, when it is once adopted an opinion, draws all things else to support and agree with it. And though there be a greater number and weight of instances to be found on the other side, yet these it either neglects or despises, or else by some distraction sets aside and rejects." So this is 1620 Francis Bacon describing quite a lot of what we've learned since, from Leo Festinger's work in the 1950s about the psychological pain that we suffer from cognitive dissonance, of hearing things that contradict our already held views. And there's great experiments that show that we have this confirmation bias where we discredit information that we don't agree with or don't fit with our already formed views. There's a great story of how Charles Darwin, when he was getting closer and closer to finalizing his theory, actually went out, he positively looked for information that contradicted what he was trying to prove. But we can't all be Charles Darwin. We are not like that. So the key point this is that this is not new stuff for us, but the environment has changed hugely. Filter bubbles are real, but that's because it's part of our nature, not an evil of technology. It's hardwired into how we think, and we need to recognize that. And it won't, left alone, it won't happen naturally in a way we may have hoped in the early days of this. We need that intervention. The second point is I'm a big supporter of fact-checking approaches. We do lots of joint work with fact-checkers, but the evidence of the impact is still inconsistent. If we're thinking about purely as correcting facts once they're out there are lots of studies that show there are potential backfire effects when actually drawing attention to these, but we need to change our view of what fact-checking is. It's less about correcting misperceptions once they're out there than prevention of them spreading, and then a deterrent effect. This third-generation fact-checking approach is really important. But the final point really is that facts are clearly not enough. We need to recognize in so much of our work, so many of the misperceptions that we see, they're often emotional and tied with identity. So it's not just about myth-busting through facts. It's about creating a story and narrative, particularly because of the way our brains work, negative information takes up more cognitive space. We give it more weight just because that's how our brain works. Evolutionary negative information was information we had to act on, so we process it differently and we store it more readily. So the challenge there is to counter that. That is a significant challenge, to get those positive stories outside with those facts. Really difficult to do, but this is a challenging section, so I feel at liberty to just leave it there. But can I just end with just a little bit of hope? That's just to clarify that I'm not at all saying that people can't change their minds and that facts don't matter. We run a whole series of deliberative events on all sorts of difficult subjects, online and offline with people. And there's great examples here and in the stands outside, and talked about widely about Taiwan and Polis doing it at scale. So there is some hope there too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duffy. Yeah, how to counter the effects of fake news rather than fake news itself, as we heard earlier on as well. Ms. Farida Dwika Yarini, thank you so much for being with us. You're Secretary General, Ministry of Communication and Information Technology of Indonesia. Okay, is fake news one of the main challenges you have to face in Indonesia?
Thank you very much for having us here. I would like to speak the challenges.
To the microphone. Thank you.
The challenges of the impact of digitalization on politics, public trust, and democracy in Indonesia. Based on the latest research by Indonesia ISP Association, Indonesia has 132 million internet users from its 256 million total population. It means 52% internet penetration in Indonesia. Referring to our constitution, years 1945, as the Indonesian fundamental regulation that everyone has the right to freedom of association, assembly, and expression. And it means that the state is sure to the public to express opinion and make the organization without any fears. However, in conveying the opinion should not violate the constitution and must respect the right of others. In terms of democracy, development in the digital era is no longer solely influenced by conventional social network in which people should have face-to-face meeting. As the impact of ICT development, the social network or democracy moved through online or social network sites. Through this medium, the public can disseminate their ideas to others more efficiently on condition that the community related to telecommunication or internet facility. The positive benefit of the digital era toward democratic development are the delivery of political messages that take place through online media or social network on the internet as fast, wide-range, continuous, two-way communication, efficient and effective way, and transparent. On the other hand, in fact, Indonesia is still suffering discomfort situation post-2014 presidential campaign and 2017 Jakarta governor campaigns. The disagreement between supporters of the parties then led to the rise of hate speech as well as overthrow others is growing tremendous in social media. On August 2017, Indonesia police have arrested 3 members of hate speech group. It's Saracen. Its name is Saracen. Saracen is one organized fake news industry. Again, political target, including our president, Joko Widodo, Saracen charged around $5,000 and spread one package of customized fake news via media social. Saracen has 800,000 social media accounts. The group doesn't only make new accounts, but also hack other accounts and follow the latest news. Based on data from January to October 2017, the total report submitted to my office from public about illegal online content reached 51 million submissions, where the first position of the report about the hate speech and pornography. However, all Indonesia stakeholders in Indonesia are not remain silent. The movement of digital literacy is getting stronger as the need to develop more positive online content and behavior on the internet to suppress the negative things of the internet. For example, the Internet Cyberwise movement that has just won the WSIS Awards 2017, then the Mavindo Turn Back Hawk movement that constantly collaborate with communities for fighting hawks. There is also the Indonesian ICT volunteer who have 10,000 of number and actively encourage digital literacy to relevant stakeholders around Indonesia. Recently launched Cyber Creation, jointly Indonesia and Indonesian multi-stakeholder effort of the national digital literacy movement. Now, Cyber Creation has more than 65 partners from government, civil association, organization, academia, technical community, and private sector. Since it was launched 3 months ago, Cyber Creation has facilitated and collaborated with around 33 multi-stakeholder initiatives or activities with a total number of participants reaching 37,000 people. The digital literacy effort is an upstream side approach, which is the government priority when it's come to online content governance. Its nature is education and knowledge development, while law enforcement and access termination is on the downstream side, carried out upon request from legitimate institutions, have authority, and conducted based on prescribed by the regulation. Thank you very much for the session. Maybe it is, we will discuss.
Yeah, we will. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a few of these figures that show that, of course, the spreading online of content, negative content, or what we commonly call fake news, is also a concern and a challenge in Indonesia. Mr. Franck Larue, thank you for being with us. You're Assistant Director General of Communication and Information at UNESCO. You were also Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of expression at the UN Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights. So, of course, that was the question I wanted to ask you to start off with. Freedom of speech on one side, fake news on the other. What can we do about it? What is the challenge here?
Thank you very much, and I thank this opportunity to participate in this excellent panel. Let me begin by making one very important statement that I've made almost everywhere I have spoken on this. Number one is I really don't like the term fake news because I think there's a bit of a trap in it. We are confronting campaigns of disinformation, and so we should talk about information or disinformation. Fake news is a trap. Why? Because it uses two different concepts. It uses fake information linked to the concept of news. And I think that is the trap. They're trying to dissuade us from reading news, from thinking the news, or from defending freedom of the press, which we believe. We can agree or disagree with the news, or with the media, or with the focus that media has. I think Dunia Mijatovic mentioned it very clearly before. There can be even mistakes done by a journalist, but that doesn't necessarily present us with the phenomenon of a campaign of disinformation that we could call dissemination of fake news. So I think what really we're confronting is something intentional that has a malicious intent, which is the dissemination campaigns. Now, disinformation campaigns. And I think this is truly happening. Now, this is not new either. This has occurred always in humanity since we exist. The difference with internet, though, is the fact that now, obviously, it can reach many more people in a faster way. And because of the interactive nature of internet, oftentimes the public itself, the users, will pick up that disinformation, reproduce it, forward it, or reconceive it in different terms. And this is why it's having a bigger effect. I think it is something we should consider, because it may put, especially on the political process, it may put a serious challenges to our democratic model. There are obviously other types of campaigns that are of criminal intent, but those are in a way already defined in Articles 19 and 20 of the ICCPR. There are forms of expression that should be prohibited by states and that are legitimately prohibited by states and are, I'm not going to go into detail to that now, but are widely defined. And I think this is important to mention. But when it comes to a systematic campaign of disinformation, especially in the political world, it can certainly totally distort the process of elections or the decision-making or the definition of policies. And this is a very serious problem, because we always thought the internet, as was said by the first panel, was going to be the facilitator, and in a way it is, of citizen participation, the voices of citizens. But I think we have discovered that just raising the voices of citizens is the first step, a very important step, but not the only one. I think we have to go beyond raising the voices of citizens to see who are the interlocutors and whether the interlocutors are listening, whether it be a parliament, whether it be government authorities, health authorities, or any other type of authority setting public policies. And this is where it really becomes a serious problem. Internet should be an instrument of dialogue, of everyone raising their voice, but actually an interactive dialogue. So here's where I put the challenge into the positive side. Governments have to discover how to use internet to interact with their citizens. It's not only a fact that the internet exists and everyone can put up their daily activities and their photos.
Not only communication, but a real interaction.
Exactly. It's more interaction and more. It's a great system for consultation, for consulting a policy, for consulting decision making. And the other positive element, it is a great way to inform citizens of what government is doing. So here's where we have to have open government, transparent government, e-forms of government. So this would be the appropriate way to confront many campaigns of disinformation, to regain trust of the citizens, is to precisely use this instrument of communication to effectively show the public what is being done in their name. Because government officials, and especially parliament officials, are elected in representation of population. Well, they have the right to know what are they proposing, what are the budget that is being used, but more effectively, what are the policies being proposed and the decisions being made. This is the positive side that I think is often neglected. So we have, on one hand, yes, campaigns of disinformation that we have to look at. But on the other hand, we also have the fact that governments have not used fully the extent and the possibilities of the internet. One last word of caution would be, in the campaigns of disinformation, we want to find different sort of alternatives. They can have serious problems, including in health, as was being mentioned on the autism and many other campaigns against vaccination or other issues that are related. And yes, we would like to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue on this, because I don't think, and it was already mentioned, I think, in the last panel as well, that the easy solution is to put it in the hands of the big platforms. The big platforms are acting as as a business. And obviously that is their logic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But effectively is not necessarily going to be the logic of all different sectors of society. So the response to some of these campaigns has to be a response that has been thought through in a strong multi-sectoral dialogue. And I think that multi-stakeholder dialogue is essential. We have always insisted this, and in the 4 principles of Internet universality that UNESCO proposes, multi-stakeholder dialogue is one of the fundamental ones. Everything related to Internet should be discussed and debated. And in that multi-sectoral dialogue, we fully endorse the idea that this possibility of these dialogues means MIL, means media information literacy. Divina mentioned it before. It is very important that we take this opportunity to show that yes, Internet is wonderful, but it has dangers and pitfalls. But precisely it's those dangers and pitfalls that will make us react and develop a more critical mind from the earliest ages of childhood, so everyone can use Internet safely, not because they're being told what to think, but more because they're being given an opportunity to have their own critical perspective and their own critical minds.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing us the dynamic between the benefits and the challenges. And thank you for the definition. You said you didn't like the fake news definition we had when we prepared this session, a lot of discussion, of course, on that matter. I'd like to share with you, if I may, that this recent expert study who found these definitions, I don't know if you all agree, but disinformation, false and deliberately created to harm people or organization or country. That's close to the fake news you were mentioning from Claru. Misinformation, false information but not created to harm. And malinformation, information based on reality but created to inflict harm on a person, a group, organization or country. I feel that helps because, of course, the whole problem is the effect of these information on democracy. Let's continue with Ms. Claudia Luciani. Thank you for being with us. You're Director of Democratic Governance and Anti-Discrimination at the Council of Europe. You're currently working on reforms in the area of democratic governance. So what would be your introductory remarks on the challenges we're facing today? You just have to press on the button. It goes red and speak really close to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. We're particularly glad that the Council of Europe is associated to this discussion because of our collective strive, that of our member states, to defend human rights and democracy based on shared definitions. And that's exactly what we are trying to do here, I believe, finding common definitions and parameters. We have recently tried to understand a little bit better what those challenges were when it comes to the impact of Internet, notably on party politics and trust, citizens' trust in parties and democracy. And we have done so in a World Forum for Democracy setting at in November this year. And I just want to share with you some of the conclusions that we had come to. First of all, it has been said before, of course, Internet is a huge enabler, technology has facilitated civic movements, the use of deliberative democracy, participative democracy initiatives, and we've heard some of them before. However, when we took a closer look at the impact, because that's what we wanted to see, the impact of those initiatives, we found out that there are some important questions to be answered. First of all, the nature of those initiatives, private versus public, their sponsorship, their transparency, their often inability to deliver on what was promised to the citizens. In other words, there was a risk that those very valuable Internet platforms disappointed citizens even more, that were already disappointed with party politics and the traditional democracy, and turned to other platforms that in fact were not able to deliver. And that is because of the question that the colleague from IPU raised before. Who decides? Who gets to decide in the end? Yes, I can share, I can participate online, but the decision-making question is fundamental. Now, these conclusions have led us to a call for understanding better how those initiatives work, to make sure indeed that they're themselves democratic, that they respect the fundamental parameters of what is a democratic initiative. In other words, that their qualities is really such that citizens would trust it and engage in a genuine fashion and not be disappointed. So for us, democracy online should not be democracy with weaker rules, but should be democracy with rules that guarantee to the citizens that they will indeed have that can be trusted and can come to deliver. I would just stop here for the first round of comments and come back maybe to social media.
Thank you. And if you have solutions to how we can strengthen that and allow people to participate in decision making, that would be interesting. Thank you very much. Mr. Gonzalo Navarro, you're the Executive Director of the Asociación Latinoamericana de Internet in Chile, and you have been acting as permanent representative of Chile at the Internet Governance Forum, notably. So, of course, you have witnessed the evolution of digitization and its impact on democracy. What are your first remarks today?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. And thank you in the way you organize this panel, because we start with the positive aspects of Internet, and sometimes we forget those positive aspects while we are addressing issues like this one. And we tend to see the glass half full and not the potential that Internet has. And it's quite good now to have this kind of dialogue in a multi-stakeholder way, because it's the only way that we can learn from these different perspectives and to address these issues and try to bring a common solution. Because that's, I think, that the ultimate objective is this panel, try to address and try to find some solutions to the issues that we are talking about here. So let me start by saying that societies and institutions and economies were built in a world in which this global network didn't exist. Therefore, people needed intermediaries and representatives to access goods, services, and to make decisions. And the digital economy is changed, and with change, obviously, we have challenges. And online companies are part of this ecosystem, and obviously this means that they have some responsibilities too. Even more, they have a stake in it, and they have to create a trustful environment, and that's usual and vital for the users. I mean, to create this trustful environment. Empowering users is a fundamental tool, and is how through them many platforms find their success and credibility. Most of the online companies are in several initiatives to help address technology trust. Most recently, for example, various online companies launched a voluntary initiative to address the issue of counterterrorism. That was one of the issues that was mentioned previously in the first round of this panel. We also addressed at the beginning of the first session that Internet is an enabler of inclusion, that digital, financial, commercial, and communications are areas where platforms act as an enablers, strengthening benefits for democratic participation and inclusion via digital means. That was precisely what Frank LaRue was addressing in terms of the opportunity that Internet is bringing to the people, especially in terms of democratic exercises through human rights like freedom of speech, for example. I think that one of the elements that we were not discussing here up to this point, but that is important, is to create a framework for to address the intermediary liability in terms of how they behave, you know, and this kind of frameworks. And in Latin America, we have a couple of cases or places where countries are taking steps towards this. Permits or enables to have predictability in order to, for the citizens specifically, to know what to do and how intermediaries are going to respond to to some of the content that can be inflammatory or fake in case. So this
is it showing like best practice on how you should. It's like education on how to use.
Education is an essential tool, and that was also mentioned before. I think the lady here was saying that this is disruptive, and disruptive is creating a crash, and that crash is an opportunity also to address the issue through education, which is fundamental here. But coming back to the legal framework, intermediary liability rules are super necessary because create that framework in which the platforms, but also the citizens and the governments can rely in order to know exactly what to do and how to do it. Cases in Latin America that are useful for this is, for example, the Marco Civil in Brazil, which contains a set of rules and principles to apply to intermediary liability and citizens. Nowadays, Argentina is taking the last steps to approve a bill of law regarding the same issue. And the same provisions that were included there must be found in some multilateral or bilateral treaties, like it was TPP or NAFTA negotiations nowadays. So that's part of the things, a mix. And I was mentioning at the beginning that I'm quite happy to be here and to be learning about different perspectives, because I think that a possible solution and a way to address this issue is a multi-sector, a multi-stakeholder approach in which we can sit, learn, and share views about what's going on and how to address it. So education is fundamental. Legal frameworks that balance rights and pros and cons are super effective too, and dialogue, multi-stakeholder dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, multi-stakeholder dialogue. We're going back to what Frank Larue told us as well earlier on. Noel Curran, hello. Thank you for being with us today. You're the Director General of EBU, the European Broadcast Union. We've been talking about fake news, which is a great issue, of course, in the newsrooms for the time being. We've been talking about media and their responsibilities and roles. What are your main challenges today in terms of digitization?
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I think I'm going to stick to talking around media issues, obviously. And I agree, I just have difficulty with the term fake news. I think it's just being used by so many people in so many different ways. I'm not even sure that I totally understand what it refers to now. It's become so complex. I prefer those references to misinformation, disinformation. And I think in terms of what Dunia was saying earlier, I absolutely agree that an awful lot of the discussion around this, I believe, has been exaggerated. But I do think when it comes to, and we have had this, we've had misinformation, disinformation, sensationalist information for a long time. What is absolutely different now is the reach. We have never in history had such a small number of companies whose platforms reach so many people, and that is a fundamental shift. I think in terms of the trust issue that arises out of some of this misinformation, disinformation, all of the categories, I think we need to remember that, the public haven't totally lost trust in media. We did a survey of 33 countries in the EBU in conjunction with Eurobarometer last year, and there is still 59% trust in radio. In some of our member countries where the public service radio station is strongest, that's 80% today in quite a few countries. And in television, the figure was 50%. In some countries in television, it was lower, in others much higher. And I think what we found was when it came to social media platforms, the figure was 21% and falling. And I think, so you have platforms that now have the biggest reach, that are actually getting the lowest trust figures and also are attracting the younger audiences. And I think that is a huge problem for all of us. That it is those platforms that are attracting more of the younger audiences and where the trust levels are so small. I think a second issue for all of us is consolidation, and I absolutely agree on the positives that have been spoken about digitization. I absolutely praise the pioneers and the tech companies that are leading the way on innovation and what they have done for society. But we do need to stand back and say, once again, we have never seen consolidation like this. Last year, 50% of the digital advertising revenues worldwide will have been taken by two companies. That's new. over 60% in the US. So we have a consolidation of reach, we have a consolidation of revenue. And the difficulty is we still don't know. We can predict because this is relatively new. Where does this go in terms of its impact on the rest of the media ecosystem? Where does it go in terms of the ability of companies, both public service and commercial, to invest in content? And we are still the big content investors. And I think we're in a bit of an experiment here because we've never seen this before. It is still relatively new, and I worry that we're not standing back enough and saying, where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years if this continues? I think other issues that arise is around standards, around approach. Social media is driving a revolution in terms of how other media cover stories. And we in the media need to question ourselves around this. And at the very least, we need to say that we are shifting our rules. We're shifting our own approach in terms of we are reporting things that even 12 months, 24 months ago, we would not have reported. And that's because they're widespread in social media. It's out there. You begin to seem irrelevant. But, you know, I don't think we talk enough around how our own approach is being influenced and our own approach is being shifted in that regard. I also think in terms of investment is absolutely being affected as advertising revenue, particularly in the digital sphere, is being affected. And I don't just mean general investment. Like if you take public service media, for me, is in a very privileged position because we receive public funding. And that puts responsibilities on us to invest in things that others don't. And without us, those things will not be invested in. And I think the pressure on all companies, both public service and commercial, in terms of what the consolidation of revenues, where the fragmentation of audiences is jeopardizing a lot of that content. And remember, an awful lot of it is European content. It's content, original content. 87% of EBU members' investments is in European content, 18 billion every year. And that is a unique contribution to European society. And I think that is a problem. In terms of coming quickly to the how can this be addressed, I think there's a responsibility on everybody. Responsibility on the state, I would argue, coming from the EBU to ensure that there is a properly funded public service media ecosystem and that public service media is not restricted from investing in the digital world. I believe that there is a responsibility on the state. I'm nervous, as some speakers were earlier, around widespread strong regulation on fake news as a reaction and what the wider implications of that is for freedom of speech and journalism. But I do think state has responsibility around hate speech, has responsibility around a whole range of things that are effectively criminal, and that those responsibilities need to be taken more seriously. I think that we in the media have responsibility, particularly in public service media, that we invest in investigative journalism, that we invest in our journalism. You know, as journalism chases the 24-hour news cycle to get it out there, immediate pressure, I do believe there is a risk that standards fall. And I think we need to invest in training, we need to invest in our journalism, and we need to invest in elements like investigative journalism, and we need to prioritize those. I think the social media platforms, we're beginning to see some kind of response. We've seen from Facebook in the last 6 months. Google made the announcement yesterday. I don't think it's enough, but there is some movement. I think they have a lot of revenue. And they could do more, but there has been some movement. And finally, I think where we all have a responsibility is around education, is around training, the lifelong learning experience that the state can help with, the training and educational programming, etc., that an emphasis that broadcasters can have, but also the training of our own staff, the talking about these issues around quality, discussing them openly, how our own approach is changing through the influence of social media and the impact it's having. So I think they're kind of the areas that I think we should be looking at.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Sébastien Soriano, you're chairman of ARCEP, which is the French National Regulatory Authority for Telecoms and Post. You're also chairman of BEREC 2017. It's the body of European regulators for electronic communications. Well, let's hear from your point of view about the challenges.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to the IGF and to Philippe Metzger to give me the opportunity to talk to you today. What I would like to stress is just to put on the table a testimony from a regulator. That is to say, somebody that is day to day working with the industry to lead the industry in the good direction. So I've been working at Competition and Telecom Authority from 15 years, working with telecom operators, media player, and internet giants. I just would like to take a little bit the helicopter view and not to talk specifically about fake news. What I think is the biggest challenge for governments, public authorities with digitalization is the acceleration. I mean, in our history, we never have met innovation with so close waves of innovation coming after one another. Internet, platforms, smartphones, Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence. All these innovations are going so fast. I mean, this is basically the main, that's the main challenge. This leads first to education, of course, but this is not my party. So I will more talk about the challenges that I see for policymakers, for legislators, when they have to define solutions to fix the problems. What is impressive with this so fast changing environment is that every day there is a new problem. I mean, we had the right to be forgotten. We have the fake news. And tomorrow we will have the artificial intelligence and new challenges every day. We have also big companies that appear in a very short period of time. I mean, it's like empires that have on less than 10 years. And this is also part of the challenge. And maybe the most difficult is that there is no certainty about the future. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, many people were talking about education, you have to learn to your kids how to code. That was basically, I mean, everybody was keen on that. Learn to code to your kids. What do we hear now? Artificial intelligence will be coding tomorrow. So don't do that. Learn to your kids poetry, art, anthropology, what the machine will never be able to do at any time. So the main challenge is how do we face the unknown? Regulating the unknown is something quite difficult. And in that frame, I would advocate in 2 directions, to be concrete, coming from my experience of a regulator. First, rely on long-term principles. When you define a principle in a law, be generic. Don't change it every 2 or 3 years. When I look at what is happening in the United States regarding net neutrality, for instance, you can be for or against net neutrality. But what is striking is that they changed their mind 3 or 4 times in 10 years. And this is not good. Principles must be laid down for a long time. And the second principle I would advocate for is flexibility when we want to implement the principles. And this is where I think we have not only to be improving ourselves, I think we really need here a revolution. Because for the governments, for regulators, it's so easy, you know, to just define something, to oblige a company to do it, and when they don't do it, you just say it's an infringement, you put a fine. But now it's not possible. Because just the time to define the problem, just the time to define the rule, then things have changed because of this acceleration. So we need to rethink totally how we regulate the markets. And what I see in my experience is that sometimes it is more efficient to nudge the market than to regulate it in a proper way with classical legal tools.
Do you have a concrete example?
Yes. So for instance, an example coming from my telecom experience. Something that is very difficult is to put pressure on telecom operators to invest in networks. This is something difficult. You have competition. Competition is good, but sometimes it's not enough, especially in the rural areas. So what we did is that this is a program that we called unbundling of the data. You know, classically a telecom regulator is unbundling the network, but here we are unbundle the data. So we have asked the operators to give us very detailed data about the coverage of their mobile network. And we have published this information on open data. And now we are working with startups that are launching comparison service. So thanks to this comparison service, you can say, okay, I live here, I work here, I take this road, I take this subway, here is where is my gym club. And then the comparison services say to you what is the best operator in terms of coverage for you. Not an average coverage of the country, but just for you. It's a tailor-made information. And thanks to that, we are nudging the market to invest more and more, and not to only compete on prices. It's important to have good prices in the market, but also to compete on investments. So typically, nudging by using data, we have a comprehensive program that we call Regulating with Data, is basically a direction, very concrete, that I really recommend to work on to find solutions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Let's try to have a bit of dialogue. I would like to go back to public. Oh, sorry, you were missing earlier on. Sorry, this Dad, you're executive director of Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan. Thank you for being here, and I didn't see you arrive before. You're one of the pioneers who have been campaigning for access to open internet, and in Pakistan and globally. We've been talking about the reach to internet and inclusive way of seeing that, and that's one of the benefits that I think most of you agree we need to protect. What would be your main challenges to face today, please?
So much, and I'm sorry, I had a conflicting workshop, so I was a bit late. But I think when we usually speak about the challenges in question, we have to take into account the violation of human rights that are occurring at the individual level, online violence, for instance, gendered or otherwise. And at the organizational level, for example, the promotion of violent extremist ideologies that enable and encourage endorse recruitment. There is also human rights violation at the official level in the form of censorship, shutdowns, and the passage of legislation that stifles and criminalizes dissent ostensibly on national security grounds. One challenge that digitization can bring, and most of the panelists have talked about it, it's the danger of false news narrative or fake news being unchecked and allowed to hijack the democratic accountability process I refer to. We have seen it occur in India with hoaxes sent via social media during and after the Indian elections. This can tie into the criminalization of freedom of expression by the state, as it means that the necessary critical digital literacy skills are not allowed to be cultivated and practiced enough. The goal is not just to bring in technology and increase the number of connected people, but to take on board democratic criticism from the public, who have in turn elected the ones they are criticizing. What I mean by this is that government officials that were elected into office and have not made good on their campaign promises, hence the criticism. Greater digitization of the avenues that people use in order to make their voices heard by the people in office can make sure that the elected are held accountable in constructive manner. Furthermore, it becomes problematic when the penalties for criminalized speech are draconian and overly broad, so that many are unclear as to where the line between democratic discourse and anti-state language begins or ends. So what we are left with is a situation where democratic voices can be silenced, as they have seen this year and in years past, by the accusation of blasphemy or glorification of terrorism, to say the least, and I'm here giving the context of Pakistan. It is important to push forward the idea that though giving someone access to technology, just as important, if not more, so is the liberty to make responsible use of said access without it being criminalized by the state in the name of national security. Digital literacy is necessary, but so is the ability to use that skill set without being penalized by the state. Awareness raising is a key component to make sure that people are made aware about the consequences of misusing technology, as well as the rewards of an inclusive public space that can come about if they put things in perspective as what they want out of a space that is global and blurs the concept of border. People, and only people, collectively are responsible to imagine and strive for such spaces that are safe and inclusive for everyone. What governments must do is to ensure that their citizens are able to utilize digital literacy skills to their fullest potential without fear of being penalized for exercising civil discourse, which is a key part of a democratic society one must replicate online and offline.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Katharina, let's throw a bit of some comments and probably questions from participants to our high-level session. I've been told I must speak in the mic. Sorry for that. Do we have comments from people following us online?
Yes, indeed. The discussion online has also been very much honing on this question of fake news. And the comments and questions have gotten a lot more concrete, so this is quite interesting. Let me highlight two questions, or two sets of questions. First one comes from Desiree Milosevic, who first of all says she agrees very much with Mr. Laroux's assessment on fake news. But then she asks a question that very much goes into this question of regulation that we've been addressing. She asks, should platforms and governments think about how to deal with filter bubbles, and what kind of policies can they employ? What kind of what policies should search engines employ, and how? She also says, what do speakers think of the Wiki Tribune initiative by Jimmy Wales to fact-check news? And the Wiki Tribune initiative is apparently an initiative that will see professional journalists and community contributors produce fact-checked global news stories. There's a second set of questions, also centering on fake news, by Sonia Renier. And she picked up on Bobby Davi's intervention. And she says, Davi argued that we can counter fake news not by fact-checking, but by providing an alternative, positive story. So she's wondering, are there any examples of this? And what channels should we use?
Thank you. Would somebody like to answer a few of these questions? Soriano.
Yes, thank you. Just about the filter bubble, maybe to give an example of application of what I said about regulating with data and how you can nudge the market and nudge people. For instance, when you have this this connected thing on here that counts your number of steps, yes. And when you open your smartphone, you have the application, they said, oh, You have walked only 3,000 feet today. This is not good, sir. You should work more than that. Why not having the same things with filter bubble? Oh, sir, yesterday you were really in your bubble. You should open more your mind. You should, for instance, go to an application, this or this, that will give you different point of view. I mean, people...
You would have to trust in the bubble to believe what the bubble says. So we're going back to public trust. Thank you for the example, of course. Thank you. Mr. Navarro.
Thank you very much. Well, the beauty of the Internet Governance Forum is that we might agree and we might disagree, respectfully offer it. I would like to offer an alternative vision of what Mr. Soriano is mentioning here in terms of how to regulate, because first of all, I'm not afraid of the future. And second, Internet is a positive element for development, and we are forgetting that. We are talking about just problems and issues, and not addressing in the positive way. I work with platforms, and usually we tend to think that all the regulation should go to big, giant companies providing services globally. But we are forgetting about the rest, the 99% of the companies that also provide services online through platforms, and they are going to be affected by the regulation or not regulation. In terms of how to regulate, it's important what Sebastian is saying in terms of we need to take one deep breath, and not to force regulation at the beginning, up front, but to think and to be flexible in terms of how we use the principles that we agree, like democracy, freedom of speech, and other public goods that are behind the regulation usually, and then try to see how we can fix or we can work towards the solution of the problem. I was mentioning that perhaps in terms of fake news or how we are going to address it, a multi-stakeholder approach could be effective because we need to discuss. We are just starting to think about these issues. And obviously, solutions are not going to come, from one day to another. But we are going to eventually we're going to find a solution. The thing is that, and I also agree with you, everything is super fast now. And we are dealing with issues, good and bad issues every day. But if we are not able to talk about this, we are not able to think and conceive new ways, have innovative ways, not only in terms of technology, but also the solutions that we find, to address these issues, we are not going anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have Mr. Duffy and then Mr. Curran, please.
Great, thank you. So just to pick up on that question of examples, just two points. One general approach and one specific from my experience. So the BBC's got a programme of solutions-focused journalism going on now, which they're just starting and trying to embed within the BBC. And the important point about that is it's not fluffy, happy news stories that you get at the end of bulletins. It's addressing real issues where you acknowledge a challenge and then work through to the solution, pointing out how it can be addressed. Because people, while we have this focus on negative information, people also look for solutions. We're naturally hardwired to look for what is the way through this problem. So that kind of fits with that. It's not distracting people with fluffy news stories. We're working on a series for next year about different together, how our diversity can actually make connections between people rather than fragment people. And it's telling those stories that is really key. And then one specific example is from the immigration sector, which we're focused on very much in the UK. So the campaigners in that sector learned very, very early on that you can't counter the misperceptions about the scale and nature of immigration in the UK by firing stats back at people, firing statistics back at people, partly because it misdiagnoses the problem, which is an emotional reaction. So people don't engage with the general, they engage with the specific. So that's where all the campaigns that we saw in the UK and in other countries about I am an immigrant, telling positive stories about immigration came through. It's not covering up, it's not trying to distract with more facts and figures. It's telling that individual story, which is what we naturally engage with as humans.
Thank you for these examples.
Just the last two questions around the fact-checking and the kind of positive journalism. I think just to say that I think everyone is responding to some degree in this. newspapers, media organizations, EBU, all setting up fact-checking units. I think we need to see over time just how effective they are. I think they're effective on the stories that they work on. It's just how many are slipping through regardless. And I think that's just something we're going to have to see over time. I think in terms of the positive news and the approach to news, there are a couple of new initiatives. There's a constructive journalism initiative which is taking hold. I've always had some misgivings about the title constructive journalism because it doesn't mean that the rest is destructive. But I do think that there are elements in that where journalists need and editors need to question the priorities that they're putting on certain stories, the number of those stories that they cover within an overall mix of a news bulletin and news output. And I think that they're important questions that we need to ask ourselves. And similarly, we in the EBU, we're starting a quality journalism initiative, which is tied in with the constructive journalism and which is, again, as much about us posing questions of ourselves as it is about anything else.
Thank you. Yes, please, Mr. Kayarandi.
Fact-checker networks, I think this is very good initiative. And it is important to go hand in hand with communities to do it. But it is therefore not only government doing it. It is multi-stakeholder can together makes fact-checker. Thank you.
There are quite a lot of initiatives at the time being around fact-checking and how to counter all this problem of misinformation. In some of the examples, it seems that asking for the participation of the public in, what are your problems and how can we answer and address it? The participative phase helps. I suppose, does it restore public trust would be one of the questions. Mrs. Luciani, you wanted to? Yeah. You have to just switch your microphone.
During the World Forum of Democracy were many fact-checking initiatives. The ones that worked best, this was tested during the French presidential campaign, were those that allied different media outlets from across a spectrum of views. In other words, the users, the voters in this case, trusted more when they thought that there was a contradiction in the fact-checking partnership. So there were different views that were looked through in a fact-checker. They trusted a lot less, or the fact-checking that was just from one media outlet was less, had less of an impact. So this is just some of the conclusions that we had. As to there is an app, actually, we reviewed that too, that helps fight the filter bubbles. It's called Reading Across the Aisle. When indeed you are brought automatically, you're made to look at a newsfeed that come from across the aisle of your normal feeds. But again, those tend to have a limited impact on fighting these echo chambers and reinforcing of messages. But they exist. So this particular one I recommend, it's extremely interesting. It's called Reading Across the Aisle.
Thank you. Do we have other examples? We were talking about multi-stakeholder perspective on, and then we'll go to the audience on how to, encourage initiative to gain more public trust. What should they be an infrastructure, a form of sort of governance about how to regulate? The word is too strong, of course, but to have a sense of surveillance of what is happening on the net and having a sort of control on the content. Should we go that far? I don't know if someone wants to answer to that. Mr. Larue, you were talking about how to encourage dialogue amongst the different stakeholders.
UNESCO has just published a study on multi-stakeholder dialogue with 4 specific cases: the case of Brazil, of Kenya, South Korea, and the IGF itself. And it was interesting because one of the conclusions we had about it is that it is important to the multi-stakeholder dialogue has to be a systematic exercise in order to have an impact. It cannot be a one-time event. And it has to be, in a way, clearly linked to the different interests and perspectives of all the different stakeholders. And the case of Brazil, which I always point out, has an additional effect, which is it has been institutionalized. Institutionalizing something is always a way of making it more permanent. Of course, it can also limit it in some cases if it's not well done. But I think in the case of the CGI of Brazil, it is interesting because now they have an independent institute of the state where they carry on their multi-stakeholder dialogue. So they were able to establish the principles, and the principles were made public. Out of the principles came Net Mundial and the policies there, and out of that came the Ley de Marco Civil, the law that they follow for Internet. So clearly this is a multi-stakeholder dialogue that had a very specific impact in policy making and even legislation in their own country. But like I said, this is part of the media information literacy that has to be done, because people participating were representing different sectors, but were strongly studying their positions before coming to the dialogue and taking very concrete proposals forward. And this is what I think made it successful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curran.
Yeah, just briefly on that, in terms of the multi-stakeholder approach, you know, I think we've heard it today. There's a lot of different stakeholders here, and if you listen to what the Commissioner said earlier, what other panelists have said, you know, in terms of around this issue and themes that are coming up around transparency, around ensuring pluralism, around skills and education. So I think there are common grounds. Where there will be differences is between the media organizations, perhaps, and the state will be the amount of direct regulation and what media organizations may react and see could be misused, particularly in some countries or under some governments, to restrict freedom of the press. And I think they will be the fault lines. But there is an awful lot of, even what we've discussed today, where there is a lot of common ground and where that multi-stakeholder approach has to have benefits if there is that much common ground.
Yes, and it's about drawing the line, of course, as we said earlier on as well. Hands are raising, so I suppose there's quite a lot of comments. Yes, let's please start with you. Just press on the microphone.
Thank you. Jelena Mucevic, Heritage Innovation Advisor. I would like to also continue with this line of questioning regards the multi-stakeholders approach, and I thank you to Mr. Navarro and Mr. Curran for touching upon this. I would like to ask the floor on their opinion whether there is really a common basic agreement between the different stakeholders. For me, this is also visible in the title of this session. So, are we really talking about the impact of digitization on politics, public trust and democracy? Or are we talking about politics, public trust and democracy within a digital world? Because the approach will be completely different. I would say that the majority of governments and traditional media are still pursuing this first approach, where the focus is on digitization, either as a tool or as a threat, which inevitably then brings forward this question of security and control and privacy. On the other side, you have private sector and the users that have been brought in the digital world that are pursuing this second approach, where the digital world is a reality. So we have to actually come up with new definitions or new forms of politics, public trust, and democracy. And the rest of the users are somewhere in the middle. So if you are talking about the multi-stakeholder approach, and these are the completely different views on engagement, on producing content, on information and misinformation, where are we on this area? Thank you.
Mr. Soriano.
Yes, and this comes to the question of threats and opportunity of digital issue. I mean, it's all about the question of government as a platform. It's thanks to the digital tools, you can totally reinvent how governments are acting, and it is maybe also a more positive way to see it. So that's mainly something discussed in the platform of the Open Government Partnership. And when I'm talking about regulating with data, as I mentioned, this is typically one part of it. And so you're right that in the end, the question is not how do we react to something, but how do we put the digital in the DNA of the governments? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir, you were asking for the microphone.
Oops. Yeah, John Carr. To complete this picture, this discussion about the impact that the internet is having on public trust and so on in democratic processes, politics and government in general, I think we mustn't overlook, it hasn't been mentioned yet, at least not that I've heard, the role of paid-for political advertising, both in relation to specific election campaigns, but also in relation to broader political campaigns, cause-related campaigns. In the old days, there was a sort of comfortable and comforting degree of imprecision about most forms of political advertising. It was there, we knew about it, but it didn't work for everybody in quite the way that it can do now, where because of the large amounts of data that the platforms have collected, people can micro-target specific demographics in particular seats, marginal seats perhaps, marginal states. I mean, let's not forget, Donald Trump did not win a majority of the popular vote, but he did win in 4 or 5 swing states. Brexit in the United Kingdom, 600,000 people voted a different way, it would have been a different result. So I'm not saying that Donald Trump or Brexit can be attributed to, yet anyway, micro-targeting in the way that I've just alluded to, but there are inquiries going on in the United States and the United Kingdom about the impact of that type of role and foreign money coming into the country to pay for it. So it's a very, very important part of the total picture and can't be divorced from the issues of filter bubbles and disinformation and so on and so forth, because it's all about public confidence in our political processes.
But would you call for a regulation and how of that? Because if you want an open internet, of course, that is the risk, is everybody can take place and everybody can deliver their message. Regulation?
We've always had rules about foreign money influencing elections. We need full transparency about any paid-for political advertising or political campaigns, and limits as well.
Thank you. Yes, Franck Larue, you wanted to answer, and then Mrs. Michel.
I think these last contributions from the public have been very important, because yes, are we trying to, when we talk about trust, are we talking about trust in democracy as a system, or are we talking about trust on internet and communication, and which was raised before? And I think this is a crucial question. I have the feeling that even democratic models, in a way, are being challenged by the new systems of communication. And we really have to have a look at ourselves in general. In a way, democracy was built on the idea that everyone should be able to participate and contribute. But when everyone participates and contributes, means that everyone should be well informed. Now, if the information is designed and almost channeled in a personalized way because of the amount of analysis of big data, then how much is induction and how much is information? And that's a crucial question. I mean, there's very serious questions being raised. I think that this is a reflection to be had. On the opposite side is the opportunities to have transparent government, as we were saying, to have the openness of knowing what is being done by all authorities, whether local, at a city level, parliament, or the executive, and even at the judiciary, to make it more open. My feeling is that one of the key actors in all this now as well will be more and more the judiciary. People are turning more to the courts also to define these issues, which is why we have been working with judges on issues of freedom of expression and access to information, which in a way were relatively new for judges. One element that I think it's important to keep in mind is that, as we were saying before, access to information is the first step, but also who is the interlocutor, who's the people speaking to, and is there a mechanism of consultation? Is communication being used in an interactive way or not? And this is crucial to say, because we also see more restrictive laws now, precisely because people are scared of disinformation or national security or other issues. There is more and more progressive restrictions. But at the same time, we see more fear in the handling. We see more shutdowns, for instance, of internet happening, more than 71 shutdowns this year alone. So
again, the line.
Oftentimes it is the lack of information which is the problem and not the disinformation.
Who should be held responsible as well for the spreading of this malinformation, for this political message we were talking about earlier? And we're talking about Facebook, Twitter. Should they be in some ways be held responsible as well for the contents? Luciani?
Mr. Larue's final comment that obviously everybody understands, including, and go back to the political parties and the trust and democratic processes. There is no doubt that internet has been a true democratic promise to users across the world, and it has helped improve the traditional parties' functioning because it has exposed them to more transparency, to more, has investigated them a lot more. Having said that, until and unless there are common definitions about what democracy online is all about and whether it is democratic, go back to what I said before, online democracy cannot be weaker than offline. Otherwise, the citizen is less protected, is more vulnerable online, contrary to the famous promise, than it is offline. So obviously, the answer is, it has been said before, multi-state governance discussion about having common definitions about what those concepts mean today and how they will evolve in the future. So we need, of course, governments, members of parliament, local government. It's very important. It hasn't been mentioned. The local dimension is very, very, because that's where democracy happens and decisions are being taken. Civil society and businesses. Council of Europe has just signed recently an exchange of letters with a number of internet companies because we want to engage in that discussion. We want to discuss with them how we can bring about those common definitions. They need them too, because they need to know that when they operate in different countries, they're not going to have different systems they're subject to, different courts shutting them down on asking content to be removed. So the need for common shared definitions is as important as ever.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going back to governance and multi-stakeholder perspective on that matter rather than straightforward regulation. We're getting close to the end, unfortunately, to this panel. There's only time for one last intervention. Yes, please. I'm sorry, you already spoke before.
I'm Sylvia Grundmann. I'm the head of the Media and Internet Division at the Council of Europe, and I service the Steering Committee on Media and Information Society. Now, this very committee is discussing all the issues and is assisting member states to come to grips with these challenges. I all invite you to read a very important report. It's called Information Disorder. I think we should have called it Information Pollution. It will help you to contribute to an informed debate, and it will help at the Council of Europe to move the issue further. And what's on the menu for the next biennium is work how to support quality journalism, online, offline. I think I stop it here, and please read to contribute in an informed manner, as Frank LaRue has said. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We had the European Commissioner before. Let us know about this. It's a question of time in history. We've been focusing a lot on misinformation, less, but probably that will be for next year on artificial intelligence. Sorry, that will be changing as well our social interactions online and offline. I would like to thank you all for your participation. We're getting close to the end of this session, and we want our host chairperson Philippe Metzger to let us know what he is, the points that he finds important to keep with us today. Philippe Metzger.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been fascinating sitting here and listening to the discussions we had. I think we had a very informed discussion, really high quality contributions and interactions. So, I mean, my prevailing sentiment is there is hope. Maybe I'm saying that in my own personal bubble, but I had the impression, sort of listening to all that has been shared, that ultimately The bottom line is that the opportunities outweigh the challenges. But of course, there are a number of points we have to work on very hard. I found it quite interesting. We had this segmentation. We have first had the section on the opportunities and then on the challenges. I found it quite interesting that many of the panelists and maybe also contributions from the audience in the first half were then often about challenges and vice versa.
Exactly.
And I think that demonstrates the complexity of the matter we're dealing with. But again, there is hope. And in my personal assessment, the opportunities clearly outweigh the challenges. I think I would like to start with the question of access. I think it has been key, has been said also by the minister this morning of Bangladesh. I think the access, of course, remains absolutely fundamental. Without access, we don't have to discuss what we're discussing today. And so this is not only access just to the actual connection, but of course it's also the information, and then it's something which gives us a tool to include everybody. I think it has been said that we ultimately, the society, a stronger society are those that are including everybody, also those, the weaker participants of society, in particular, members of society. And in that sense, I think it is important to restate from the outset that the internet, of course, is an extremely positive tool for development overall. I'm saying that also as a member of the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, and we're also there. We're trying to figure out very concrete also policy and regulation recommendations to give that access to everyone, because I think that's the basis. Without that, we don't have to discuss any further. And from that, I think the theme certainly was prominent here, was the question of public services ultimately. I think it's quite a good phrase to coin it that way, Tech 4.0 against Government 2.0. I think that the dichotomy, and it's quite clear that there the governments are dependent on the stakeholders. I think the governments can learn from the stakeholders and improve the public services that they are rendering, not just for the sake of it, but for the stakeholders themselves. So I think that interaction there will be key, so that government doesn't stay at the 2.0 level and moves on into a more modern mode of modus operandi. And I look at myself as well. I mean, we have the same challenges in my government service. So I think that's something we have to constantly remind ourselves. But of course, we are reminded by the stakeholders. That's why we're here together. Related to that is certainly the aspect of transparency and accountability, which will definitely increase through the digital technology and the internet. We heard from the parliamentary point of view what could be improved there, how it can be modernized. I think that's just one aspect. Of course, Parliament as a key player in the democratic processes, but again, I think it applies across the board. And then, of course, if you talk about Parliament, you really come to the key issue of participation and of the exercise of your fundamental rights. And I thought, I mean, the example I heard from Brazil with the e-petition project, I found that a very telling story of the potential that the digital world, the internet, are unleashing. I also thought the e-complaints system, a complaints hub system, a very telling story, which also in a very concrete way demonstrates the benefits that we can reap from the digital tools. And then, of course, bottom line for all this aspect of ultimately of infrastructure and of public services and the engagement in the public sphere is education. I think it's quite clear that we have massive challenges there. Of course, we have opportunities, but we have to provide the proper education to everyone, basically, so that we have a full engagement. So, I mean, that for me was a bit of the one aspect on overall infrastructure and services and interaction for political purposes. I mean, by that I mean democratic processes of taking decisions with all the stakeholders. And then, of course, we had a strong focus on the question of information versus misinformation. I'm using that as a term now because I think quite correctly there were many reactions to the term fake news, and I found it quite interesting. The moderator at some stage said as a sort of a temporary conclusion, well, of course, fake news is of great concern. What certainly resounded with me more than fake news is of great concern was actually the statement by one of our panelists who said that we should not overreact to fake news. I think that for me was a key aspect, and certainly, I mean, not overreacting is one thing, and then I think the other very fundamental thing for any democratic society is not to censor. So not to go into situations because you have a significant concern with misinformation that you overreact by censoring. I think that I find very key. I think there were a number of voluntary efforts by various stakeholders that were mentioned, which are laudable. Of course, also the intermediaries, also NGOs, for instance, that are fact-checking. But there as well, I think what I found a key conclusion, certainly that I heard, was that we could use that challenge, or we should use that challenge of misinformation to re-engage with the governments and with the state, and that the governments should not then ultimately actually disengage and delegate responsibilities away when it comes to assuring a proper information of the public. So I think that is also a beacon of hope. I think if that is an opportunity to re-engage with the state, with the governments, and together with the population, I think that is something which is healthy. I'll come to the values in the end, because I think it boils down ultimately to the question of values as well. And of course, the public trust will be key in this. I found the figure quite interesting, the 59% of trust in the radio. And it's quite clear that we have there tools, we have public broadcasting systems in a number of countries, which also can support that effort in building or rebuilding the trust. And again, I think when it comes to that, education again. Somebody used the phrase new cyber literacy. I think that could maybe reflect well what we have to look at going forward, because we also find at the national level, we find it difficult at times to engage, for instance, with the young citizens or even pre-citizens, because they are in their own channels. And so I think that is something that we should bear in mind. So the question is, where does that leave us going forward? We have indeed a situation where we're grappling with speed. I think that was made very clear. We are hugely challenged by the speed of the developments that we're dealing with. Everything happens so fast, and there is no certainty about the future. We have consolidation phenomena, which both in terms of reach and revenues, which of course affect also the investment in the infrastructures and services that are relevant for building that trust and for the democratic processes. We have clearly disruptive nature of big data and artificial intelligence, again, where we don't have ready-made recipes to find solutions just like that. And somebody mentioned that we didn't have no international cyber crime or cyber policy. And so if you look at those challenges going forward, I think it is an important statement that was made that we will have to look at the more long term, and we have to find, to the extent possible, main principles that allow us to set a certain base or set a certain frame to then find tailor-made solutions in the cases at hand going forward. And I think to that principle-based basis for future digital cooperation, I think also belongs the question of cross-border enforcement. I think we clearly have an issue when it comes to trust by the public, that we often don't find the perpetrators of any crime that happens, for instance, online in our courtyard, in our home country. It's somewhere else. And so I think we have a clear challenge there to also focus on cross-border enforcement of the existing rules and laws that we have, because we have so much. And again, I think it was said on the panel yesterday, I would like to repeat that. I mean, the international laws and the laws we have, the rules that apply in the analog world, they also apply to the digital world. And I think that is clearly a case for better enforcement across the borders. So maybe I'll finish on a very almost philosophical level. In a sense, I think this is about transferring our human nature into the digital space, or making it, how shall I say, make it use the digital space to the best of our possibilities, although we have a number of new phenomena that we don't really know yet how to solve. And so I think there is hope. Again, in the long term, people learn. The book was mentioned by somebody, I think, what happened with information. I mean, the 15th century, there was information put out. It wasn't verified. It wasn't necessarily accurate. It could be wrong. So people learned as well. Of course, we have the speed issue. And the question is how much that will test our physical and human limits. But I think it boils down to really to the strong value system. That was mentioned in the discussion as well. I mean, the discussion we've had today, there's clearly some strong values amongst all of us that allow us to have the debate we have. And I think to find that value system going forward under new circumstances in a digitally challenged world, and to invigorate that system as well sometimes, because sometimes we had a strong value system and we have lost it partly, be it through generations, be it through also other challenges in integrating certain groups in our society. So that, of course, ultimately is the DNA of the multi-stakeholderism, to find common values and to find common solutions. And I liked very much yesterday what Kathy Brown said on the panel, on the high-level panel with our president, that she was identifying agreed outcomes on the panel. And I think agreed outcomes could be a good sort of guiding goal almost for our IGF here and also the coming editions to move forward and become more concrete in finding solutions, because that's certainly in my role as a government official, that's what I'm challenged to do, find concrete solutions and try to help our society moving forward. So I'd like to thank everyone here on the panel very much. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to be the chairman of that debate and to be able to listen to it very carefully. And I look very much forward to our coming discussions this week and, of course, the many more years to come. So thank you also very much to our moderator, who has done a stellar job. Thank you very much, Mrs. Ducomin. I wish you all a very successful IGF here in Geneva, a safe return home, and all the best for next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metzger. That wasn't an easy task. Applause. To wrap up the content of this panel, it was so rich and it's such a complex theme. So thank you ever so much. I would just like to address our apologies to the translators, because I have been told it wasn't always easy to catch what everybody was saying because of the microphone. So sorry for that, because you do a fantastic work. Apologies. Thank you very much for your participation and have a lovely day. Thank you.
1, 2, 1, 2, test, test micro. 1, 2, 1, 2, test, test. Test micro. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test micro HF. Test micro cravate. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test. Va bene così? No, è un po' di meno, di meno. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test, test micro. 1, 2, 3, test micro, cravate. Vado? Sì. 1, 2, 3, test micro, cravate. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test. Come? Un, deux, trois, 1, 2, 3, test micro. Ok, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test micro cravate, 1, 2, 3, test, 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 1, 2, 1, 2. No, ça va bene. Come ti senti? 1, 2, 1, 2, test, test. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Un, deux, trois, test. 1, 2, 3, test, test. Un, deux, trois, test. Test micro. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Un, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, test. Sì, è meglio così, eh? Sì, sì. 1, 2, 3. No, ma 1, 2, 1, 2. Sì, sì, infatti è molto... Un, 2, 1, 2, 3, test, test. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, test. Test, test. Un po' alto ancora. 1, 2, 1, 2, test, test. Un, 2, 1, 2, test, test. 1, 2, 3, test, micro cravate. Bene così. Un po'. Sì, sì. Tengo su? Vabbè. Test.
Sound check, sound check. Sound check. Sound check. Sound check.